Toltecs of the New Millennium. Acknowledgements. I would like to express my recognition to the following beings, whose presence in the world has contributed in a very significant way toward the realization of the present work. To my Teocaris, the Jicareros of Santa Maria, for the simplicity and joy with which they carry out the titanic task of maintaining alive their tradition amid these difficult times. To Thierry and Maria del Mar for their support and impetus in the realization of my madness. To Manolo, Rene, and Armando for their friendship and courage in the battles we shared. To my father, the sun. To my mother, the earth. To my brother, the deer. To my grandfather, the fire. To the spirit. Introduction. I do not write these lines out of whim, nor am I interested in presenting myself as the chosen heir for transmitting the tradition to which I am linked. I write them as part of a task and a responsibility that was revealed to me among indigenous peoples of Toltec descent, and that came to me directly from the Spirit. Although I will not relate everything I witnessed having to do with the procedures and body of practices of said tradition, I will speak of things that I would personally have preferred to keep secret. But this task is not a personal matter. It implies assuming my responsibility as a witness and participant in one of the most profound and powerful spiritual traditions of the Mesoamerican indigenous world. The survival of these traditions at the dawn of the new millennium offers answers to the urgent necessities of change, which members of modern society require in the crisis of our time. As you will be able to appreciate in the following narrative, I was not elected due to any particular quality by an indigenous master possessor of unworldly powers. Rather, I infiltrated into their separate reality and connected myself with their tradition through agents beyond my comprehension, but which had something to do both with the enormous generosity of those people and my persistent efforts. The principal thesis of this book is that the Toltec tradition is not a dead tradition to which we can refer only through stories and legends. It is a living tradition with living practitioners among the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Its survival coincides historically with the presence of sincere searchers who put aside the ways of fantasy, or ideology, and in some way exert themselves in a struggle similar to that which characterized the ancient Toltecs and which characterizes the survivors. The tradition is only surviving at the dawn of the new millennium. It is transforming itself into a seed about to germinate, a seed that points to the rebirth of Toltequity from a spiritual rather than ethnic point of view. As I explained in my earlier work, The Teachings of Don Carlos, the material that was then presented formed only a part of the work that I have carried out for more than 15 years, both among indigenous peoples and the formation of development groups. What remained pending was the publication of materials that gave testimony to the other areas of realized work. The present volume corresponds to the second part of my testimony, and it relates to the concrete experience in the indigenous world. Soon I will make known the third element of this trilogy, in which I expand upon the origin, nature, and method of my work with the human development groups I have formed. I am speaking of indigenous peoples, yes, but not those described by anthropologists, transformed through their interpretations into a backward expression of humanity, and bearers of a folklore that sooner or later will end up in museums or in ethnological or historical works, where they will continue to tell us of our cultural richness or our great historical past. The Indians of whom I speak, my brothers of the mountains, have very little to do with what is taught in courses on shamanism, nor are they interested in taking us on as apprentices. They are in their own element, which is quite removed from our artificial world of concepts and concrete. Distance notwithstanding, however, today it is vitally important for us to learn even a little of that in which they are experts, the encounter with the spirit and the intimate and harmonic relationship with the sun, the earth, and the fire. The Indians to whom I refer speak very little, and when they do, they don't sound like a university professor or a Buddhist master. Nor do they walk on walls or cross canyons by levitating. But they have an enormous advantage over the Indian sages of movies and books. They are of flesh and blood. They exist, and anyone who makes sufficient effort can see them. These indigenous peoples are bearers of their own very efficient tradition, which does not operate as a body of beliefs or empty religious practices, but rather as an ensemble of precise procedures allowing a person to experience a wide range of perception, much wider than that normally allowed by the culture of modern Western society. In this work, I speak of the way the indigenous survivors of ancient Toltequity look for and encounter the spirit, and the way they relate themselves with the principal powers of nature. A way in which there are no books, ideas, beliefs, explanations, interpretations, or intermediaries. A way in which the affair is entirely between the individual and what's out there. No one promises or sells you anything. No one tells you what you will encounter. I am speaking of an arduous path that lasts an entire lifetime. A difficult path, yes, but real, profound, and tangible. That is the way of the Toltec. No history, no beliefs. Doing and seeing for oneself, without intermediaries. The book consists of 9 chapters, and the epilogues divided in 3 parts. The first is a general description of the historic presence of the Toltecs. The second deals with the way I got in touch with the Indians descendant from the ancient Toltecs and the main features of their spiritual tradition. The third and most important part of the book is a testimony to some of my experiences living and learning among these extraordinary people, from my first contact with them to the moment I got involved with my whole being in the practice and living of Toltequity. It should be made clear that I refer to those Indians with whom I have lived and learned, calling them Toltecs, as the word was used among the native peoples of Mexico in the 16th century. Toltec refers to the man of knowledge, the person who has mastered the deepest arts and learning. They, however, do not call themselves Toltecs, but rather Wirarika. Another reason for calling them surviving Toltecs of ancient times is that they are the direct inheritors of the spiritual culture of the historical Toltecs. Beginning with the fusion between the Toltecs and Wirarika, which occurred after the disintegration of Tula in the region known as Aztlan. The Toltecs of the new millennium are those indigenous peoples of the Sierra who, against wind and tide, have been able to resist the most brutal pressure that for 5 centuries has been trying to destroy them. They are those who, in the ineffable force of their tradition, have encountered sufficient resources to give them a foothold in the 3rd millennium without having lost their own paths of search and encounter with the energy that sustains the universe. But the Toltecs of the new millennium refers not only to the survivors of ancient Toltequity, they are also those human beings who, amid modern society, with all its noise and confusion, are opening pathways to recover the magical heritage that was robbed from us. Pathways that bring us to comprehend and revitalize our intimate connection with the spirit. These new men and women, who, just like our old grandfathers from Tula, uniting themselves with the sun in the task of illuminating the darkness and the mystery, are the seed of the new Toltequity. Even when this knowledge awakens sincere interest in those who search for substantial alternatives, it is very important to avoid an invasion of spiritual seekers, and any other kind of invasion, into indigenous territories. It is of vital importance to preserve these zones of refuge in which the indigenous peoples of Toltec descent have managed to survive, utilizing their geographical isolation as protection against the presence of whites or mestizos threatening the survival of their material and spiritual culture. For this reason, I have changed the names of the communities in which I work and the people who figure in the story. The truth is that generally I'm not a friend of hiding things or disguising the facts. But the indigenous people themselves have asked me to avoid as much as possible waking the curiosity of people that could result in the undesired presence of mestizos or whites in those areas they with so much difficulty have managed to keep isolated. The foregoing notwithstanding, I wish to emphasize that the indigenous peoples of whom I speak are alive and continue with their practices in this very moment. I did not make up the facts, nor did I complement them with fiction, as so often occurs in unconfirmed tales having to do with indigenous knowledge. Nurtured in many cases more by Western fantasies about the Indian sage than by the presentation of concrete experience. My proposal is that we develop our own paths to encounter the Toltec that lies hidden and waiting inside each one of us. The principal features of the way of the Toltec, which we can follow without invading indigenous communities, are contained in the work, The Art of Living Purposefully. There I detail the methodology and form of work that I have developed through courses, fieldwork, and workshops that together constitute a proposal of human development, nurtured by indigenous knowledge and the non-conventional encounter with nature. What I have learned among the surviving Toltecs is but a small part of their knowledge. But to experience their everyday sense of integration with the natural world, and to share their trips through the unusual possibilities of perception, has made me face what I consider a fundamental lesson that concerns all of us humans. We are luminous beings, giving no importance to what our ego and our ideas tell us about ourselves. The essential truth about our nature remains in agreement with what our grandfathers expressed in ancient Tula. We are children of the sun. Our nature is to shine. Victor Sanchez, Valle de Anahuac, September 1995. Translator's note. Translating from Spanish presents certain problems. Apart from the problems normally encountered when moving from one linguistic universe to another, that relate to the use of gender. In Spanish, the word su is used to indicate his or her, depending on the context. On other occasions, the Spanish language uses masculine grammatical forms to indicate either female or male. Changing the gender from the way it appears in the original Spanish text to a more genderless form is therefore not always easy, and on occasions, this style may even change the meaning of a given passage. The problem is further compounded when the text relates to things spoken originally in an indigenous tongue, or spoken in Spanish by indigenous people. Spanish spoken this way is quite different from official Spanish. This difference in the way indigenous people speak Spanish also reflects their views of the world as distinct from that of city dwellers. Ideally, my work as a translator should be to translate into modern English, which at present is experiencing a strong movement toward demasculization. However, since this book deals with a society different from ours, with a distinct copy of reality, both the author and I regard the context of the situations as they occurred as being of primary importance, and therefore consider current trends in the English language as secondary. In situations that refer to the sun, the earth, the water, or the wind, for example, this perspective can readily be appreciated. For Native peoples, these are not simply objects existing in the world to be referred to using it, but rather as him or her. The sun and his power, earth and her lessons of love, the wind and his unpredictable behavior, the water and her ability to give life. We find another example in the word Maracame, the Wirarica shaman. Although there exist few women Maracames, among the Wirarica, they are so rare that the Maracame is always referred to in the masculine form. So, if I were to change this to reflect current English language trends, it would result in a different view of reality than that portrayed by the author's original text. This is why we have decided to leave the text as it appears originally in the Spanish, changing to he or she, for example, only in those places where the content of the original would remain unaffected. This is solely our decision and does not necessarily reflect the point of view of our English language publisher. Part 1. The Toltec Tradition. Chapter 1. The Historic Toltecs. Historical knowledge of the Toltecs, like everything else having to do with our pre-Hispanic past, is scarce and confusing. This is due not only to the lack of written documents or the insufficiency of archaeological findings, but also to the difficulties arising from trying to comprehend civilizations that have a very different perception of the world in relation to the conceptual references of contemporary thought and cosmovision. How did the Toltecs live? What were they interested in? What kind of world did they perceive? The answers to such questions would be equally difficult if the Toltecs themselves were present here in front of our eyes in this instant. In the same way, direct observation of the behavior or way of life of living indigenous peoples does not necessarily give us substantial answers to similar questions. Actually, in spite of the years and years of field observations, studies beginning from the reports of Sahugun to modern anthropological studies, the indigenous universe remains unpenetrated by religious or scientific investigators. This arises from the Eurocentric notion, which in general the rest of the world shares, that there is no universe or reality other than that which we perceive normally. Therefore, the indigenous world, past or present, seen through non-indigenous eyes and thought, is always a distortion from what the indigenous world is in itself, as it is perceived by those who live within it. All historical studies, ethnological work, and human sciences in general would have to be revised and reestablished, beginning with a phenomenalistic Don Juanist proposal that the world, such as we perceive it, is a description we received at the time we were born, and then learned to construct as we incorporated ourselves into the social world. Thus, if we place an indigenous Mazateco and a man from the city in the same room or in the same spot on a mountain, they will find themselves in separate realities, and they will see different worlds. While the indigenous man sees in the table of statistics on the wall only lines without meaning, the man in the city looks with worry at the decline in the productivity of his business. While in the woods, the indigenous man listens and learns from the trees. But the businessman will only see raw material to be used for commercial purposes. Naturally, if the indigenous man were to speak of the lessons he receives from his brothers, the trees, or of the spirits of the mountains, the city man would think, "Ah, these little superstitious Indians, poor things," without suspecting that he himself is a prisoner, trapped within his singular vision of the world. Only the man of knowledge is capable of crossing the parallel lines which keep the worlds apart, to discover there are countless more worlds to be perceived and experienced. Later, I will go into more depth with this theme. Indigenous reality is then extremely elusive, and even more so when we are dealing with past reality. The Aztecs themselves, about whom there exist a great number of ethnographic traces and documents written during the time of the arrival of the Spaniards, are a source of debate and controversy, with many different historical views currently coexisting and competing among themselves. The ancient Toltecs, much further back in time, are an enormous mystery about which there exist only legends. Legends the Aztecs told. Legends told by ethnohistorians. Legends told by storytellers in many indigenous communities in Mexico. Legends told by the Maracames. Legends told by men of knowledge. Legends told by the surviving Toltecs, alive in our time. On the other hand, and still more important than the legends and stories, is the living testimony. The Toltecs of today, who constitute one of the central themes of this book. I am aware of the almost insurmountable difficulty in wanting to comprehend the indigenous universe from our contemporary Western universe, and of the scarcity of information available. Nevertheless, I will comment on some characteristics of the Toltec world that are plainly evident in the legends and indigenous tales, as well as in academic investigations on this subject. Although official history places the Toltecs in a period stretching from the 9th century to the 12th, the origins of Toltequity are lost in the darkness of time. Its oldest vestiges can be traced in a line that projected through time, could be perceived as the Olmecs, Teotihuacans, Toltecs, and later, after the disintegration of Tula, dividing itself into such varied spheres as the Wiraricas, Aztecs, and Maya. Quetzalcoatl. The figure that stands out the most in the Toltec world is without doubt Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, also called Huemac. Due to his representation in codices and archaeological findings, it is possible to know the Toltec character of many pre-Columbian peoples. He can be observed in the pyramids of Tula, Hidalgo, where can also be found the so-called Atlanteans. We find him in Xochicalco, Morelos, a meeting place for wise men of many different indigenous groups. They came specifically to deepen Toltec knowledge, in particular, the multiple aspects of the human universe relationship. In Chichen Itza, Yucatan, the same plumed serpent descending the principal pyramid indicates the beginning of spring each March 21st, in an amazing effect of shadow, which gives us a minimal example of the profoundness and precision of Maya Toltec knowledge about the universe. This also occurs in Xochicalco, where a ceremonial grotto is illuminated through an orifice opening to the outside, precisely on the solstice, signaling the beginning of summer on June 21st. The bird serpent conjunction we find again in the emblem of Mexico Tenochtitlan, which is preserved to date on the flag of Mexico. The examples could go on to cover the greater part of our territory and the Central American countries. Quetzalcoatl represents many things relating to historical events, as well as to symbols of a philosophical and spiritual nature. He is known as the cultural hero and civilizer who carried the Toltecs to their highest level of technical and spiritual development. And although everything seems to indicate that there existed a human Quetzalcoatl who was governor of Tula, the symbol of the plumed serpent, representing the elevation of that which before was lowly, transcends the historic personage. He was called Quetzalcoatl precisely for having achieved within his person such spiritual elevation. It should be remembered that in the highest pre-Columbian cultures, religion and science were not separate. Rather, they formed part of an integral knowledge that allowed an appropriate relationship of the individual with his or her world. Therefore, it is not strange that the knowledge of Quetzalcoatl expresses itself the same in technical scientific knowledge as in that relative to the development of awareness and a spiritual life. The Toltecs disperse. The mysterious departure or disappearance of Quetzalcoatl is associated with the end of Toltec splendor, and there exist many tales and legends dealing with this matter. However it was, toward the end of the 12th century, Tula was abandoned, and the Toltecs disbanded. Wandering, they distributed themselves in different regions of Mesoamerica, which, in greater or lesser measure, became enriched by the presence of the Toltec sages. Starting from this period, due to Toltec influence, the Maya attained heights never before reached. Some of the groups originating from ancient Tula settled in the proximity of Nayarit and Sinaloa 5 centuries before the Spanish invasion would oblige them to take refuge in the high mountains where to date they can be found. Precisely in that region, from a basically Toltec population, was formed the famous Aztlan. From there proceeded the 12 tribes, who, after a pilgrimage of 200 years, following a message from the world of dreaming, founded Mexico, Tenochtitlan, giving origin to the Mexica people, also known as the Aztecs. Chapter 2. Toltecayotl. The Toltecs were not a warrior people in the classic sense of the word, meaning they were not dedicated to wars of conquest or similar matters. The Toltecs were a people who held the arts and knowledge in high esteem. Among them, the culture of flower and song reached its highest expression. They were warriors of the spirit. The Mexicas themselves called the arts and sciences Toltecayotl, Toltequity, and the person of knowledge was Toltec, the sage. As they were not focused on warlike activities, the Toltecs centered their interest on knowledge and the spirit. The daily life of both simple and principal members of society was devoted fundamentally to religion, which preserved its original character as the way to the spirit. At this point, it would be well to note that for the ancient Toltecs, as well as for those surviving today, religion was not like our modern religions. A standard of predetermined conduct, dogmas, or the projection of human self-importance to the spheres of the divine, often used to manipulate the masses for the benefit of a small, dominant group. Rather, it was, as mentioned, a series of forms and practices whose objective was to keep people in contact with the spirit. From our own perspective, and from our modern conception of religion, we attempt to observe and comprehend non-Western religions, and we fail. As we interpret pre-Hispanic religions, for example, we fall into the error of believing that our conceptions having to do with religion are universal. Thus, if we observe a Wirarica speaking respectfully of the sun, or performing some ritual to link with the energy of the earth, we are compelled to think that the Wiraricas consider the earth and the sun to be their gods. In the face of these multiple symbols and representations of the abstract, we usually say simply that they believe in many gods. The majority of religions made the representations of the spirit more and more complicated, to the point where they took these representations for reality and ended up inventing God. The ego and self-importance participated actively in the process, and God wound up being in image and likeness to the human ego, with desires, anger, the need for recognition and praise, and so forth. At this point, religion came to believe in all these tales invented collectively about God, and to act in accordance with codes of conduct derived from such tales, which casually just happened to coincide with the private interests of the group in power. It did not happen like that among the ancient Toltecs, nor does it happen that way among some surviving ethnic groups of Toltequity, who keep their original religion almost intact and therefore continue to be a true way to the encounter with the spirit. Another relevant aspect of Toltec spirituality expressed in their religion is its pragmatism, as we can observe in this short talk I had with Don Pedro de Haro, one of the most powerful and respected maracames of the Wiraricas in the Sierras, during my stay in San Sebastian. No, son, you people think that we Indians are fools, no? Because we believe in many gods and who knows how many other things. But our religion, unlike that of the Tiwaris, mestizos, or whites, is not a matter of believing, but rather of seeing. Look, I'll tell you what I told a gringo, one of those who call themselves pastors, and who believe that we are all his flock. He was obstinate and letting on about Christ here and the Bible there. And then I told him, Now, let's see. How do you know if Christ did or if Christ didn't? Well, did you know him? Well, not in person. And have you known anyone who knew him in person? Of course not. He lived 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years? You're kidding. And how do you know if he existed? Or if they're nothing but fables? Well, we have his word here in the Bible. Oh man, we are lost. I don't even know how to read. And then you tell us that Indians are stupid because we believe in the earth and the sun. Stupid. But nobody tells me about Tate Urianaka, the earth. I see her every day. And every day I receive her fruits, corn, water, and beans. I can touch, walk, and live on her. And Tao, the sun. Daily I receive his heat and his Nayarika, light, knowledge, vision, teaching. I don't have to do anything but look up, and there he is. And besides, what did Christ produce? As far as I know, he never produced anything. While the earth, on the other hand, just look at her. All the time she is producing. And she feeds us. And that's how we live. So, who are the fools? Well, we got rid of him. That's why none of those kind have ever been able to enter her. Not them, nor the others. The Spirit. The intuition of the Great Spirit is inherent in humans. The feeling of being incomplete or alone has accompanied us throughout all of our history. And it is not due merely from fear or weakness that we have invented gods. The fact is that behind or at the bottom of all that exists lies an ultimate energy that animates and moves everything existing. The ancient Chinese called it the Tao. Modern physicists simply call it energy. The Maya, Hunabku. The Wirarika Tatewari, or Ayusi. The ancient Toltecs, Ometioto, or the eagle. And the warriors of the new Toltequity call this all-sustaining force, mystery, Nawal, intent, or simply spirit. However, names are the least important, since what really counts is the link that by our acts we are able to maintain with that energy. The objective of the person who goes to knowledge is, from the Toltec perspective, to encounter the spirit and be one with it, expressing its natural flow through everyday actions, flowing and behaving in accordance with the spirit. Our actions do not encounter insurmountable obstacles. Rather, they are efficient, harmonious, and powerful, besides giving us peace and well-being. Thus, all of our difficulties arise from the fact and from the moment in which the individual, or society as a whole, loses awareness of its link with the spirit, and therefore acts in discord with the natural flow of energy. Nature, the visible face of the spirit. Every part of the existing world is nothing other than the visible face of the spirit. But people, blinded by their own feelings of importance, have lost the awareness of their relationship with the spirit, and therefore feel themselves to be separated from everything, aspiring even to be above everything. Nature, on the other hand, is not a victim of the spell of reason, and therefore she expresses in a natural way the flow of the spirit. This is why many men of knowledge have had, as teachers, a ravine, a mountain, or a tree, while others have become apprentices of a wolf or a deer. To list some examples. Toltec knowledge, not having devolved into religious forms empty of the spirit, as one of its fundamental aspects the observation and relation of humans with nature. It does not place us as the king of creation, nor as the highest and most developed element in nature. Rather to the contrary, aware of our dangerous tendency to remain spellbound by our own thoughts. It realizes that we are the ones who need to learn from nature in order to reintegrate ourselves and occupy the place that naturally belongs to us within her. This difference between our religious concepts and those of the world of Toltequity remains manifest in the fact that while for us in Western culture, God is bearded, male, naturally, and often wrathful, the Wirarika represent the energy that governs the world as a blue deer. Today, modern people, tied to our compulsive anthropocentrism, consider the worship of nature a primitive form of religion that preceded the modern concept in which one God with human form and characteristics is worshipped. However, this is nothing more than another form of the arrogance displayed by Western culture. We insist on putting ourselves at the center of everything, viewing nature and everything in it as inferior, a simple accumulation of resources placed there exclusively for satisfying our needs and desires. This suicidal attitude of continuing to harm the environment in order to satisfy the compulsive need to accumulate more and more capital is but one of the consequences of said arrogance. This should bring us to reconsider our point of view regarding the backward worship of nature. Isn't it much more reasonable and even urgent that we learn again to feel respect and veneration for the earth, the sun, the mountains, the rivers, and the animals. We damage nature, use and abuse her, because we consider ourselves outside of her. We don't accept that we ourselves are part of her. And in destroying her, we are destroying ourselves as well. The spiritual practices of indigenous peoples, so tied to nature, are and were a much more reasonable way to relate to the environment from which they derive a healthy, rather than suicidal, use of natural resources. This spiritual feeling nourished their technical scientific activity as well, from which it was not divorced, allowing for large population centers in pre-Hispanic Mexico without a growing deterioration of the environment. The way of Toltec knowledge. Following this same perspective, the initiation of a Toltec to knowledge is not an exclusively human affair, not determined by the existence of a teacher and a student. The apprentice learns from nature and ultimately from the spirit. The presence of sorcerers, healers, maracames is not to transmit knowledge from themselves to an apprentice, but basically to push those wanting to learn so that they establish contact with the spirit, which indicates true knowledge. This is why Toltec men of knowledge rarely speak. Their techniques of teaching, besides setting an example, constitute an enormous range of activities and complex procedures, which must be carried out by those who work and learn from them. Such procedures tend to open the door to silent knowledge, which is a hidden possibility in every human being. In the indigenous rituals of initiation, it is not an adult or teacher who initiates the apprentices, but rather they initiate themselves with nature. The young man, to convert himself into a warrior, has to carry out a long hike over unknown mountains and territories to search for a magic deer who gives lessons in how to live. The ritual to be carried out before sunrise, the cathartic dance or ritual to be performed before the power of a thunderstorm. The learning gained during the arduous ascent of a sacred mountain. These are examples of this teaching realized through a relationship with nature. I recall a conversation I had with Augustine, a young Wirarica from Santa Maria. And you, Augustine, have you gone to human Kulubai? Not yet, but maybe soon. And why haven't you gone yet? Well, because I'm afraid. It's really scary. One doesn't go for pleasure, but rather out of obligation. Why do you say that? What do you go for? Well, to see. This is where Tamatsin, Tamats Kahulumari, the great-grandfather tale of the deer, tells you what you are going to do. If you will dedicate yourself to the land, or to curing, or to singing, or to being a maracame. Just for these things, I'm telling you, you need to struggle a lot. And that's why I'm afraid. If you don't do everything well, then you see purely horrible things, devils, and things like that. And if, for example, you want to be a healer, who teaches you? Another healer? No, of course not. First, you receive a sign there in human kuluabai. If the deer speaks to you and tells you, listen, you're going to be a healer, then you have to be a healer. And how do you begin? Who teaches you? Nobody. One has to learn by oneself. But how? If nobody teaches you, how can you learn to heal? Well, like I told you, look, if he who has received the sign goes home, but does not begin because he lacks confidence, he makes a fool of himself in good time. Although he has already received the order, if he still is too afraid to begin, then the deer appears in his dreams and tells him, "What are you waiting for? Begin now." And so the deer follows him, pestering and pestering him, while the would-be healer does nothing. Until one day, one of the members of his family falls ill, and he has no choice, and he has to heal that person as best he can, with herbs, chanting, by drawing the sickness out with his mouth, any way he can. And that's how he starts. When another member of his family becomes ill, he also heals him or her. He can do it since Tamatsin gave him this gift, and so he is now a healer. And once he cures those of his family, does he announce to the rest of the Wirarika that he can cure? No, he says nothing to no one. But his neighbors gradually come to know him as a healer. And when someone becomes sick, they look for him, and so his fame grows, according to how successful he is. For the same reason, it is not merely a human knowledge. The knowledge of the warriors of Toltequity did not consist, nor does it consist of words learned in books or heard from the teacher's lips. Although words exist between the apprentice and the person who pushes him or her toward knowledge, these play a secondary role and are useful generally after the apprentice has personally experienced knowledge. For the true experience of knowledge, there are no books, teachings, teachers, or words. The only way is the life itself. The only teacher is the spirit and its visible face, nature. Teaching yourself. Nahuatl was the language of the Toltecs, Aztecs, and many other indigenous peoples from the ancient and contemporaneous Mexico. In the Nahuatl language, there exists no concept of learning as it is conceived in the West, where we learn from someone else, specifically a teacher. In that tongue, the word closest to the English phrase to learn would be nimomashtik, translated literally as teaching yourself. Thus I was told by my first teachers of Wirarika dance, two children who encouraged me during a long ritual. Teach yourself, teach yourself. This is why we who truly assume the responsibility that signifies the way of knowledge clearly understand that masters, books, or groups are only aids of greater or lesser value, according to circumstances. They are to be used for our own battle toward knowledge and freedom, at which we will arrive by our own efforts and our own will, taking our own steps with our own energy. And in any case, the only indispensable elements needed are a ready spirit and the necessary energy to begin the way. If these are present, the external aids will appear in whatever form. On the other hand, if we lack internal conviction or the necessary energy, all the greatest masters, all the books read, all the courses taken cannot help us. In the era in which we live, the teach yourself that our old grandparents knew is especially relevant. The time of the masters has passed, and the time has arrived for each one of us to assume our own responsibility. This is not the time to put the only true inheritance we have, that is to say, our one and only life, into the hands of masters or guides, whether they be genuine or not. Considering it carefully, if we can deal directly with the spirit, why do we need intermediaries? Your time has arrived, and it's here and now. Use it